Hey guys! Picture this. It's negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind is howling like a banshee with a grudge, and you're standing in what is now Minnesota wearing nothing but animal skins and sheer determination. No thermostat. No electric blanket. No Starbucks. Just you, Mother Nature, and her absolute commitment to turning you into a human popsicle. Think your morning commute is rough? Try surviving an ice age winter with nothing but your wits and whatever dead animals you could catch. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Welcome to the absolutely delightful world of pre-Columbian climate survival, where staying warm wasn't just about comfort. It was about not becoming a frozen corpse that archaeologists would find centuries later and give some terribly academic name, like late woodland period thermal management failure subject number 7, because nothing says dignity like being remembered primarily for your inability to regulate body temperature. Let's start with a reality check that would make your ancestors laugh until they cried frozen tears. When European settlers first stumbled onto this continent, shivering in their wool coats and complaining about the savage cold, they encountered people who had been thriving in these conditions for thousands upon thousands of years. And I do mean thriving, not just barely scraping by, but actually developing sophisticated, ingenious methods of staying toasty that would make modern engineers weep with envy and shame. The first thing you need to understand about Native American thermal management is that it was never about one magical solution. Oh no, that would be far too simple for people who had to survive in a world where winter didn't just mean time to turn up the thermostat. It was an intricate, beautifully orchestrated symphony of techniques, materials, and knowledge passed down through generations of people who understood one fundamental truth. Nature is trying to kill you, but if you're clever enough, you can make nature work for you instead. Take the humble teepee, for instance. When most people picture a teepee, they think of it as some sort of primitive tent, a quaint temporary shelter that looks picturesque in Western movies. What they don't realize is that they're looking at one of the most sophisticated pieces of thermal engineering ever devised by human beings. The conical shape isn't just aesthetically pleasing, it's a masterclass in heat circulation and wind dynamics that would make modern architects question their entire career choices. The genius begins with the shape itself. That perfect cone isn't arbitrary. It's the result of centuries of refinement and testing in conditions that would kill you faster than you could say central heating. The steep walls allow hot air to rise naturally, creating a circulation pattern that distributes heat evenly throughout the space. Meanwhile, the pointed top allows wind to flow over and around the structure, rather than creating the kind of devastating pressure that would turn a modern tent into expensive confetti. But here's where it gets really interesting, and I want you to comment below if you've ever tried to heat a space efficiently. The Native Americans understood something about insulation that we're only now rediscovering in our modern obsession with: energy efficiency. They didn't just throw up a single layer of buffalo hide and call it a day. No, they created what was essentially a double-walled system that would make your local contractor weep with inadequacy. The outer covering, made from carefully prepared buffalo hides, and we'll get into that nightmare process later, was just the beginning. Inside, they would hang a second liner, creating an insulating air gap that trapped warm air and prevented cold from penetrating. This inner liner, called a dew cloth, did double duty by also preventing condensation from dripping onto sleeping occupants, because nothing ruins a good night's sleep like being slowly dripped on by your own frozen breath. And speaking of breath, let's talk about the ventilation system, because this is where Native American engineering reaches levels of sophistication that would make NASA jealous. At the top of every teepee were smoke flaps, adjustable openings that could be positioned to control airflow based on wind direction. These weren't just holes in the fabric, they were precisely designed openings that created a Venturi effect, drawing smoke up and out while preventing downdrafts that would fill the space with choking smoke and defeat the entire purpose of having a fire in the first place. The fire itself deserves its own dissertation in applied physics. Native Americans didn't just pile up some logs and hope for the best. They understood fire management at a level that would make modern camping enthusiasts look like bumbling children. The fire was positioned in the exact center of the teepee, not just for even heat distribution, but because they had calculated the precise point where maximum efficiency could be achieved without turning their home into a smoke-filled death trap. They built their fires small and hot, using carefully selected woods that burned cleanly and produced maximum heat with minimum smoke. Different tribes had different preferences based on their local environment, but the principle was universal: efficiency over spectacle. These weren't the roaring bonfires of Hollywood movies. They were precisely controlled heat sources that could keep a family warm through the coldest nights while using a fraction of the fuel that our modern heating systems devour. But the real genius, and this is where I want you to pause and think about your own daily struggles with heating bills, was in how they managed heat retention throughout the night. They didn't just let the fire burn out and hope their body heat would carry them through until morning. Instead, they developed a system of heated stones that functioned as prehistoric thermal batteries. During the day, while the fire was burning, they would place carefully selected stones near the heat source. Not just any stones, rocks that wouldn't crack or explode when heated, chosen through generations of trial and error that undoubtedly involved some spectacular and dangerous failures. As evening approached, these stones would be moved to strategic positions around the sleeping area, where they would radiate heat throughout the night. Think about that for a moment. While you're programming your smart thermostat and complaining about your electric bill, these people had developed a completely sustainable heating system that used nothing but renewable resources and human ingenuity. No fossil fuels, no electrical grid, no monthly bills from the power company, just pure, elegant efficiency that kept families warm in conditions that would send modern humans running for the nearest hotel. I want you to comment below about the coldest you've ever been and how you dealt with it, because I guarantee it wasn't as cold or as consistently life-threatening as what these people faced every single winter for their entire lives. The clothing systems were equally sophisticated, and this is where we start to see the true artistry of survival. When European explorers first encountered Native Americans in winter conditions, they were often shocked by how warm and comfortable these primitively dressed people appeared to be. What they didn't understand, because they were essentially thermal engineering novices, was that they were looking at layering systems that had been perfected over millennia. The base layer was often made from the softest, finest furs, rabbit, marten, or other small animals with dense insulating pelts. This wasn't just because it felt nice against the skin. It was because these furs created thousands of tiny air pockets that trapped body heat while allowing moisture to wick away from the skin. Modern base layers try to achieve the same effect with synthetic materials and high-tech fabrics, but they're essentially attempting to replicate what Native Americans figured out through necessity and survival. Over this base layer came the primary insulation, larger pelts like deer, elk, or buffalo, depending on what was available in their region. But here's the crucial part that most people miss. These weren't just random animal skins thrown over shoulders. Each piece was carefully prepared, strategically positioned, and designed to work with the other layers to create a complete thermal management system. The outer layer was where things got really sophisticated. This was their weather protection, wind and water-resistant materials that could handle the worst conditions nature could throw at them. Buffalo robes were the premium option, not just because buffalo were large and provided lots of material, but because buffalo fur has unique properties that make it almost supernaturally effective at blocking wind while maintaining breathability. And let's talk about those buffalo robes for a moment, because the process of creating one was an exercise in precision that would make modern manufacturers jealous. The hide had to be taken from the animal at exactly the right time of year when the fur was thickest and most dense. It then had to be processed through a series of steps involving brain tanning. Yes, actual animal brains that would soften the hide while preserving its natural water-resistant properties. The brain tanning process alone was a chemical masterpiece that we're still trying to fully understand. Animal brains contain the perfect combination of oils and enzymes to break down the collagen in hide without destroying the fur or compromising the material's durability. Native Americans discovered this through pure experimentation and necessity, creating a process that produces leather superior to many modern alternatives. But we're just getting started with the ingenuity, and this is where survival becomes art. Because staying warm wasn't just about individual clothing and shelter, it was about community strategies that turned groups of people into efficient heat-generating and heat-sharing systems. Extended families didn't just live near each other for social reasons, they lived in carefully planned configurations that maximized thermal efficiency for the entire group. Multiple teepees would be arranged to create windbreaks for each other, with the openings positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds for ventilation, while protecting against cold drafts. Shared fire areas between lodges created communal heat sources that could warm multiple families while using less fuel than individual fires. Even the placement of food storage and work areas was designed with thermal management in mind. Let me know in the comments if you've ever lived in a situation where you had to cooperate closely with others just to survive, because that's essentially what every winter was for Native American communities. There was no individual thermal comfort, there was only group survival, and everyone had to participate perfectly, or people died. The sophistication of their food-based warming strategies would make modern nutritionists weep with admiration. They understood that certain foods generated more body heat during digestion, what we now call the thermic effect of food, and they planned their winter diets accordingly. High-fat foods like pemmican, made from dried meat, fat, and berries, weren't just calorie-dense survival foods. They were carefully formulated thermal generators that could keep internal body temperature elevated for hours after eating. They knew which plants contained natural compounds that improved circulation and helped maintain core body temperature. Teas made from specific herbs weren't just pleasant warm drinks. They were targeted thermal management tools that addressed everything from peripheral circulation to metabolic heat generation. Even their meal timing was calculated for maximum thermal benefit. Large meals before sleep weren't just about feeling full and satisfied. They were about generating digestive heat that would help maintain body temperature through the coldest parts of the night, when external heat sources were at their lowest. So far, we've only scratched the surface of how these incredible people managed to not just survive, but thrive in conditions that would challenge our modern technology. What we've covered represents maybe 10% of their total thermal management knowledge, and even that fraction is enough to make you question everything you thought you knew about staying warm. In our next section, we'll dive deeper into the truly mind-blowing techniques they used, including methods so ingenious that modern scientists are still studying them to develop better cold weather technology. We'll explore the darker, more desperate measures that had to be taken when normal methods weren't enough, and the incredible innovations that emerged from the absolute necessity of not freezing to death. Comment below with your thoughts on what we've covered so far. Are you starting to see these historical survival methods in a new light? Because trust me, we're just getting warmed up. Now let's talk about the truly diabolical genius that emerged when basic survival wasn't enough. When winter decided to get personal and throw everything it had at people who had already mastered the art of not freezing to death. Because Mother Nature, in her infinite sadistic wisdom, always had one more brutal surprise waiting for those who thought they had figured out her game. Picture this nightmare scenario. You're already doing everything right. Your teepee is perfectly positioned, your fire is burning efficiently, your layered clothing system would make a modern outdoor gear company weep with envy. And then winter decides to have what we might politely call a mood swing. The temperature doesn't just drop, it plummets to levels that make your carefully calculated survival strategies suddenly seem as useful as a screen door on a submarine. This is where Native American ingenuity transcended mere survival and entered the realm of what can only be described as thermal sorcery. They developed techniques so advanced, so counterintuitive, and so effective that modern cold weather researchers are still trying to reverse engineer them in laboratories with million-dollar budgets. Let me introduce you to the concept of the sweat lodge. And before you start thinking this is some kind of spiritual spa experience, let me clarify that we're talking about one of the most sophisticated heat therapy and thermal conditioning systems ever devised by humans facing existential cold weather challenges. The sweat lodge wasn't just about getting warm, it was about fundamentally altering how the human body responds to extreme cold. The process began with construction that would make modern sauna manufacturers question their entire approach to heat retention. A dome-shaped framework was built from carefully selected saplings, not just any wood, but specific species known for their flexibility and heat resistance. This framework was then covered with multiple layers of hides and other materials, creating a space that could achieve and maintain temperatures that would make a modern sauna jealous. But here's where it gets really interesting, and I want you to comment below if you've ever experienced extreme temperature changes. The heating system was based on heated stones, but not just any heated stones. These were specific rocks, carefully chosen and prepared, that had been heated in fires for hours until they reached temperatures that could literally cook food. When water was poured over these stones, the resulting steam didn't just create heat, it created a controlled thermal shock system that trained the body to respond more efficiently to cold exposure. The physiological effects were nothing short of miraculous. Regular sweat lodge sessions actually increased the body's ability to generate heat internally, improve circulation to extremities, and enhanced the efficiency of the natural shivering response. In modern terms, they were essentially hacking their own metabolisms to become more cold-resistant. They were turning themselves into human thermal power plants through controlled hypothermia exposure. And when I say controlled, I mean controlled with a precision that would make modern medical professionals nervous. The temperature gradients, the duration of exposure, the cooling down procedures, all of it was calculated based on generations of observation and refinement. People who messed up this process didn't just have a bad day, they died. So every aspect had to be perfect, every single time. Let's talk about sleeping systems, because this is where survival meets what can only be described as prehistoric engineering genius. You think your memory foam mattress and electric blanket are the height of sleeping comfort? Let me introduce you to sleeping arrangements that could keep a family of 6 warm through a blizzard using nothing but animal products and human ingenuity. The basic sleeping platform was raised off the ground, not just for comfort, but because ground contact was essentially thermal suicide in extreme cold. The platform itself was constructed to allow air circulation while providing insulation, often using materials like dried grass, pine needles, or specially prepared plant fibers that created thousands of insulating air pockets. On top of this platform came the bedding system, and this is where things get really sophisticated. Multiple layers of furs were arranged not randomly, but according to specific thermal properties. The bottom layer was typically made from animals with dense, fine fur that created maximum insulation against the sleeping platform. The middle layers provided bulk insulation, while the top layer was chosen for its ability to trap and hold body heat while allowing moisture to escape. But the real genius was in the shared sleeping arrangements. Families didn't just pile together randomly for warmth. They arranged themselves according to carefully calculated heat distribution patterns. Adults who generated more body heat were positioned to maximize heat transfer to children and elderly family members. Even the positioning of individuals within the group was strategic, with the warmest people placed where they could most effectively share their heat with those who needed it most. Comment below if you've ever had to share body heat for survival, because for these people it wasn't just an emergency measure, it was a nightly strategic operation that meant the difference between waking up healthy and not waking up at all. Let me tell you about food preservation and thermal cooking methods that would make your modern kitchen appliances look like children's toys. Native Americans didn't just figure out how to stay warm, they figured out how to use heat so efficiently that they could create warming foods and preserve thermal energy in ways that modern technology is still trying to match. Take the phenomenon of stone boiling, which sounds like something a mad scientist would attempt, but was actually a daily reality for people who needed to extract maximum nutrition and thermal benefit from their food. Large stones would be heated in fires until they were literally red hot, then carefully transported using wooden tools and dropped directly into containers filled with water and food. The result wasn't just cooked food, it was superheated nutrition that could raise core body temperature for hours after eating. The thermal mass of the stones meant that cooking continued long after the initial heat transfer, creating slow-cooked meals that extracted maximum nutritional value while generating sustained internal heat. They had essentially invented slow cookers and thermal cooking systems centuries before modern technology caught up. But the really impressive part was how they managed to do this safely, repeatedly, without anyone dying from steam explosions or thermal burns. The stone selection process alone was a masterclass in applied geology. They had to identify rocks that wouldn't explode when superheated, wouldn't contaminate the food with dangerous minerals, and would retain heat efficiently. Get any part of this wrong, and you'd either poison your family or blow up your dinner. Winter hunting strategies deserve their own chapter in the annals of how to not die while acquiring calories in impossible conditions. Modern hunters with their heated blinds, thermal clothing, and GPS devices think they know something about cold weather hunting. Native American hunters were operating in conditions that would send modern outdoor enthusiasts running for their heated vehicles, and they were doing it with equipment they had to make themselves from materials they had to hunt and gather, personally. The clothing systems for winter hunting were masterpieces of specialized design. Different activities required different thermal management strategies, and hunters developed clothing that could be adjusted and modified based on activity level, weather conditions, and hunting requirements. Too warm, and you'd sweat, which could freeze and kill you. Too cold, and your manual dexterity would fail at the exact moment you needed it most. They created scent-masking systems using plant materials and natural compounds that didn't just hide human odor from prey animals, but also provided additional insulation and wind resistance. Even their camouflage served double duty as thermal management, using materials and arrangements that broke up human outlines while creating additional insulating air pockets. The hunting tools themselves were designed with thermal considerations in mind. Bowstrings that wouldn't snap in extreme cold, arrow fletching that would remain flexible at temperatures that would make modern materials brittle, and spear points that could penetrate frozen hide without shattering. Every piece of equipment had to function flawlessly in conditions that would challenge modern manufacturing. Let's discuss emergency warming techniques for situations when everything else failed, because winter always had one more trick up its frozen sleeve, and survival often came down to desperate measures that required split-second decision-making with no margin for error. Body heat sharing in emergency situations went far beyond normal sleeping arrangements. When someone was suffering from hypothermia or extreme cold exposure, the entire group would implement warming protocols that involved direct skin-to-skin contact, shared breathing techniques, and coordinated body positioning that could literally save lives in minutes. These weren't gentle, comfortable procedures. We're talking about aggressive warming techniques that could cause severe pain as circulation returned to frozen extremities. But the alternative was death. Everyone in the group had to know exactly what to do, how to do it, and how to recognize when someone was moving from cold discomfort into life-threatening hypothermia. They developed field-expedient shelter construction techniques that could create life-saving thermal protection using nothing but materials that could be gathered in minutes from the immediate environment. Snow caves, debris huts, and windbreaks that could be constructed quickly enough to save lives when caught in sudden weather changes, or when primary shelters failed. The psychological aspects of extreme cold survival were just as sophisticated as the physical techniques. They understood that mental state directly affected physical heat generation and survival capacity. Group morale management, storytelling, and community activities weren't just entertainment. They were survival strategies that kept people mentally engaged and physiologically active during the long, brutal winters. Breathing techniques that increased oxygen efficiency and improved circulation were passed down as essential survival skills. These weren't just meditation practices. They were medical interventions that could improve cold tolerance and help maintain core body temperature through controlled respiratory patterns. Let me tell you about the absolute masterpiece of thermal engineering that was their winter water management. Getting access to unfrozen water in extreme cold wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival, and the methods they developed to maintain water access would make modern engineers weep with admiration and shame. They created insulated water storage systems using animal bladders, plant materials, and strategic positioning that could keep water from freezing even when external temperatures would turn exposed water into solid ice within minutes. These weren't just containers. They were sophisticated thermal management systems that used body heat, ground temperature, and insulating materials to maintain liquid water when it should have been physically impossible. Ice fishing wasn't just about catching food, it was about accessing water while maintaining thermal comfort and safety. The techniques for cutting through thick ice, maintaining open water access, and staying warm while engaging in an activity that involved direct contact with near-freezing water required knowledge and skill that modern ice fishers with their heated shelters and power tools can barely comprehend. They developed portable heating systems that could be carried and deployed quickly when away from established camps. These weren't just fire-starting materials. They were complete thermal generation systems that could provide life-saving heat in emergency situations using minimal resources and set-up time. Snow and ice weren't just obstacles to be endured, they were resources to be utilized. They understood the insulating properties of snow and could create thermal barriers and windbreaks that actually used winter weather conditions to improve their survival situation. Snow caves and ice shelters that were warmer inside than outside, despite being made entirely from frozen water. The integration of all these systems into daily winter survival routines required a level of knowledge, skill, and coordination that made everyday survival look like advanced engineering. Every person in the community had to understand their role in the larger thermal management system, because individual failure could mean group death. Children were trained from early ages not just to endure cold, but to actively contribute to family and community thermal management. This wasn't just about toughening them up. It was about ensuring that every member of the group could function effectively in conditions that required perfect coordination and flawless execution of survival techniques. Are you starting to understand the sheer scope of knowledge and skill that was required just to survive a single winter? Comment below with your thoughts on how these historical survival methods compare to our modern dependence on technology and infrastructure for basic thermal comfort. We've covered maybe 20% of their total thermal management knowledge, and what we've explored so far is enough to revolutionize modern cold weather survival techniques. But we're just getting to the really impressive stuff, the techniques so advanced that modern science is still trying to understand how they worked. Now we're entering the realm of thermal management techniques, so advanced that they border on what can only be described as prehistoric biotechnology. We're talking about methods that were so sophisticated, so counterintuitive, and so effective that modern researchers with access to computer modeling and million-dollar laboratories are still scratching their heads trying to figure out exactly how they worked. Let me introduce you to the concept of metabolic heat manipulation. And before you start thinking this sounds like some kind of new age wellness nonsense, understand that we're discussing survival techniques that could literally mean the difference between maintaining core body temperature and becoming a frozen corpse that future archaeologists would classify as woodland period thermal regulation failure, specimen 23b. Native Americans discovered something that modern medicine is only now beginning to understand. The human body's heat generation system can be consciously controlled and dramatically enhanced through specific techniques that essentially turn you into a biological furnace. They developed breathing methods, physical exercises, and mental practices that could increase internal heat production by amounts that would seem impossible if we didn't have modern scientific evidence proving that such techniques actually work. The foundation of this system was what we might call controlled hypothermic conditioning. Now, this sounds absolutely insane to modern ears, but stay with me because the logic is actually brilliant. They would deliberately expose themselves to extreme cold under controlled conditions, training their bodies to respond more efficiently to temperature drops. It's like interval training, but instead of building cardiovascular endurance, they were building thermal resilience. The process involved gradual exposure to increasingly severe cold conditions while maintaining conscious control over breathing and muscle tension. Over time, this training would actually alter how their circulatory systems responded to cold, improving blood flow to extremities and increasing the efficiency of their natural heat generation mechanisms. They were essentially hacking their own physiology to become more cold resistant. But here's where it gets really impressive, and I want you to comment below if you've ever tried any kind of extreme temperature training. They could achieve states of internal heat generation that would allow them to remain comfortable in conditions that would incapacitate untrained individuals. We're talking about the ability to maintain normal body function while wearing minimal clothing and temperatures that would send modern people running for their heated cars. The breathing techniques alone were masterpieces of applied physiology. They developed specific respiratory patterns that could increase oxygen efficiency, improve circulation, and generate internal heat through controlled hyperventilation, followed by breath retention. Modern researchers studying these techniques have found that they can actually alter blood chemistry in ways that improve cold tolerance and increase metabolic heat production. These weren't just breathing exercises, they were medical interventions that could be deployed in emergency situations to prevent hypothermia and maintain survival capacity when external heat sources weren't available. The knowledge of exactly when and how to use these techniques was passed down through generations of people who understood that getting it wrong meant death. Let's talk about something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about prehistoric technology. Their development of thermal storage and heat transfer systems that functioned essentially as biological batteries and heat pumps. They created methods of capturing, storing, and redistributing heat that were so efficient they could maintain warmth for extended periods using minimal energy input. The heated stone systems we discussed earlier were just the beginning. They developed techniques for preparing stones that would retain heat for specific durations, release heat at controlled rates, and transfer thermal energy with precision that modern heating systems struggle to match. Different types of stones were selected and prepared for different applications, some for quick, intense heat release, others for slow, sustained warming over many hours. But the real genius was in how they integrated these thermal storage systems with their living spaces and daily activities. Stones would be heated during cooking activities, moved to sleeping areas for night warming, then repositioned for daytime heat as needed. They essentially created a thermal management network that recycled and redistributed heat energy with an efficiency that would make modern energy engineers weep with envy. They developed heat transfer techniques using animal fats and oils that functioned as thermal conductors and insulators. These weren't just random applications of available materials. They were precisely formulated compounds that had been tested and refined over generations to achieve specific thermal properties. Modern lubricant manufacturers are still trying to recreate some of these natural compounds. The integration of thermal management with food preparation created systems that extracted maximum heat energy from every piece of fuel while simultaneously preparing nutrition that would provide internal heat generation for hours after consumption. They weren't just cooking food, they were creating thermal medicine that could maintain core body temperature through metabolic heat production. Now let me blow your mind with their understanding of microclimate manipulation, the ability to create warm spaces within larger cold environments using nothing but knowledge of air movement, heat transfer, and thermal dynamics. These people could create temperature differentials of 20 or 30 degrees within the same general area using techniques so subtle that casual observers wouldn't even notice what they were doing. They understood how ground temperature variations could be exploited to create warming zones. Certain areas would be slightly warmer due to underground thermal activity, solar exposure, or protection from wind, and they could identify and utilize these natural heat sources to improve their survival situation. Modern thermal imaging confirms that these temperature variations exist, but they were finding and using them with nothing but experience and observation. Windbreak construction wasn't just about blocking cold air. It was about creating thermal circulation patterns that would trap and concentrate heat in specific areas. They could build temporary shelters and barriers that would create warm microclimates even in exposed locations, using principles of aerodynamics and heat transfer that modern architects are still studying. They developed techniques for using vegetation and natural materials to create insulating barriers that would prevent heat loss while maintaining ventilation. These weren't just random piles of plant matter. They were carefully engineered thermal management systems that could create habitable spaces in conditions that should have been uninhabitable. Let me tell you about their mastery of fire science that went so far beyond simple combustion that it bordered on thermal alchemy. They understood different types of fires for different applications with a precision that modern fire safety engineers would find impressive. This wasn't just about making flames, it was about controlling heat output, burn duration, fuel efficiency, and smoke production with scientific accuracy. They knew which woods would produce sustained heat with minimal smoke, which materials would create quick, intense heat for specific applications, and how to combine different fuels to achieve precisely the thermal characteristics they needed for each situation. Different fires for cooking, heating, emergency warming, signal making, and tool preparation, each with its own requirements and techniques. The fire management techniques included methods for maintaining fires through extreme weather conditions that would extinguish modern heating systems. They could keep fires burning through blizzards, high winds, and conditions that would challenge modern technology. Emergency fire starting techniques that could produce flame using minimal materials in conditions where modern fire starting tools would fail completely. They developed smokeless fire techniques for situations where fire was necessary, but smoke could be dangerous or problematic. These weren't just low smoke fires. They were combustion systems that produced virtually no visible smoke while maintaining high heat output. Military personnel still study some of these techniques for tactical applications. Underground fire systems that could provide heat without visible flames were used for extended heating applications and situations where surface fires weren't practical. These subterranean heating systems could maintain ground temperature for days after the initial fire had been extinguished, creating warming zones that could be used repeatedly. Comment below if you've ever had to start a fire in difficult conditions, because these people had to master fire creation and management in situations where failure meant certain death, and they had to do it repeatedly, perfectly, using only materials they could gather and tools they could make themselves. Let's discuss their development of what can only be described as prehistoric thermal clothing technology. We touched on layering systems earlier, but the advanced techniques they developed for creating, maintaining, and optimizing cold weather clothing systems were so sophisticated that modern outdoor gear manufacturers are still trying to reverse engineer some of their methods. The fur preparation processes alone were masterpieces of applied chemistry and materials science. They could alter the thermal properties of animal pelts through specific treatment techniques that would enhance insulation, improve moisture management, and increase durability. Brain tanning wasn't just about softening hide, it was about creating materials with precisely controlled thermal characteristics. They developed techniques for creating composite materials by combining different types of fur, hide, and plant fibers to achieve thermal properties that couldn't be obtained from any single material. These weren't just layered systems, they were integrated material technologies that combined the best characteristics of different natural materials into single garments. Waterproofing techniques that would maintain breathability while providing weather protection were achieved using natural compounds and treatment methods that modern chemical companies are still trying to duplicate. They could create materials that would repel water while allowing moisture vapor to escape, solving one of the fundamental challenges of cold weather clothing design. The fit and adjustment systems they developed allowed clothing to be modified for different activity levels and conditions without compromising thermal performance. Garments that could be loosened for high activity periods to prevent overheating, then tightened for rest periods to maximize heat retention. Modern outdoor gear with its complex zipper and vent systems is essentially trying to recreate what they achieved with simple, reliable adjustment methods. Repair and maintenance techniques that could restore damaged clothing to full functionality using field-available materials meant that thermal protection systems could be maintained indefinitely without access to replacement materials. They could repair torn garments, restore waterproofing, and even completely rebuild damaged clothing using nothing but materials they could gather and tools they could make. The specialized clothing for different activities was so advanced that it approached what we would recognize as technical outdoor gear. Hunting clothing that provided camouflage, scent control, weather protection, and thermal management, while allowing for the precise movement required for successful hunting. Work clothing that could protect against specific hazards while maintaining comfort and thermal regulation during extended physical activity. Winter travel clothing that could protect against the specific challenges of moving through snow and extreme cold while carrying equipment and maintaining the energy reserves necessary for long-distance travel. These weren't just warm clothes, they were integrated systems designed for specific applications that required different thermal management strategies. Their understanding of how clothing interacted with shelter systems created integrated thermal management approaches that maximize the effectiveness of both systems. Clothing designed to work optimally with specific shelter configurations, shelter systems that enhance the effectiveness of particular clothing combinations. Everything worked together as a complete thermal management system. Are you beginning to understand the incredible depth of knowledge and skill that was required just to create and maintain the clothing systems necessary for winter survival? This represents maybe 30% of their total cold weather survival knowledge, and we haven't even gotten to some of their most impressive techniques yet. The integration of all these systems, metabolic heat control, thermal storage, microclimate manipulation, advanced fire science, and sophisticated clothing technology, created survival capabilities that modern cold weather experts with all their high-tech equipment struggle to match. These weren't just survival techniques, they were complete lifestyle systems that allowed people to thrive in conditions that would challenge our best modern technology. In our next section, we're going to explore the really mind-blowing stuff. The techniques that are so advanced that modern science is still trying to understand how they work, including methods for surviving conditions that should have been unsurvivable, and innovations that emerged from the absolute necessity of not dying in situations where everything else had failed. Now, we're entering the absolute pinnacle of prehistoric thermal engineering, techniques so advanced and counterintuitive that they make everything we've discussed so far look like elementary school science experiments. We're talking about survival methods that border on what can only be described as thermal wizardry, developed by people who faced winter conditions so brutal that failure wasn't just uncomfortable, it was an immediate death sentence served with a side of frozen misery. Let me introduce you to something that will fundamentally change how you think about human adaptation: the development of group thermal synchronization systems. This wasn't just people huddling together for warmth. This was coordinated physiological manipulation that turned groups of individuals into single, highly efficient thermal management organisms. Think of it as prehistoric biotechnology that created human heating networks more sophisticated than modern climate control systems. The basic principle involved coordinating breathing patterns, heart rates, and metabolic functions across multiple people to create synchronized heat generation and distribution. Groups would engage in specific activities and exercises that would align their physiological heat production, creating collective thermal output that was dramatically greater than the sum of individual contributions. They essentially turned human biology into a coordinated heating system. The timing and coordination required for these techniques was absolutely precise. Different individuals would take turns engaging in heat-generating activities, while others focused on heat conservation and distribution. The result was a continuous cycle of thermal production and management that could maintain group survival through conditions that would kill isolated individuals within hours. But here's where it gets really impressive, and I want you to comment below if you've ever been part of a group survival situation. They developed specific roles and responsibilities for thermal management that were assigned based on individual physiological characteristics, age, health status, and thermal generation capacity. This wasn't random cooperation, it was strategic deployment of human resources for maximum thermal efficiency. Pregnant women, children, and elderly individuals weren't just protected by the group. They were integrated into the thermal management system in ways that maximized their contribution while ensuring their survival. Everyone had a specific function in the larger heating network, from fuel gathering and fire maintenance to heat distribution and thermal monitoring. Failure to perform these roles perfectly could mean death for the entire group. Let's talk about something that will make modern medical professionals question everything they know about hypothermia treatment. Their development of rapid rewarming techniques for severe cold exposure that were more effective than many modern medical interventions. These weren't gentle, gradual warming procedures. These were aggressive, coordinated treatments that could bring someone back from the edge of freezing death using nothing but human effort and natural materials. The techniques involved controlled application of heat, coordinated circulation stimulation, and specific breathing and movement protocols that could restore normal body function to individuals who were essentially clinically hypothermic. The knowledge required to perform these treatments safely was extraordinary. Too little intervention and the person would die. Too much and you could kill them just as effectively through thermal shock. They understood the precise stages of hypothermia and cold injury with accuracy that modern emergency medicine is still trying to match. They could identify exactly when someone was transitioning from cold discomfort to life-threatening temperature loss, and they knew the specific interventions required for each stage of cold injury. This wasn't just practical knowledge, it was advanced medical understanding that had been refined through centuries of life-or-death applications. The group coordination required for these emergency warming procedures involved multiple people performing different aspects of the treatment simultaneously. Some would be preparing heat sources, others would be performing circulation stimulation. Still others would be preparing warm food and beverages for internal heat generation. Everyone had to know their role and execute it perfectly under extreme stress conditions. Emergency shelter construction techniques that could create life-saving thermal protection in minutes, using nothing but immediately available materials, reached levels of sophistication that would impress modern emergency response teams. These weren't just crude windbreaks. These were rapidly deployable thermal management systems that could create habitable microclimates in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. The speed and efficiency with which they could construct these emergency shelters was absolutely crucial, because in extreme cold conditions, you don't have hours to build protection. You have minutes before cold exposure becomes life-threatening. Every movement had to be planned and coordinated to maximize efficiency while minimizing heat loss during construction. Now let me tell you about their mastery of what can only be described as thermal camouflage and stealth heating systems. These were techniques for maintaining life-saving warmth while remaining completely undetectable to potential threats, whether those threats were hostile human groups or dangerous wildlife attracted to heat sources. They developed methods for creating heat without visible flames, thermal signatures or smoke that could give away their location, underground heating systems, concealed thermal storage, and heat distribution methods that could maintain survival temperatures while being completely invisible to external observation. Modern military stealth heating technology is essentially trying to recreate what these people achieved using Stone Age materials and pure ingenuity. The sophistication of these concealed heating systems included methods for venting combustion gases in ways that wouldn't create detectable smoke plumes, techniques for dispersing heat signatures to prevent thermal detection, and heating methods that could be extinguished instantly if concealment became necessary. They could literally disappear their thermal signatures while maintaining the heating necessary for survival. Comment below if you've ever had to hide while staying warm, because for these people, the ability to remain thermally comfortable while being completely undetectable could mean the difference between survival and becoming someone else's dinner, either literally or metaphorically. Let's discuss their development of thermal medicine, the use of controlled heat application for treating injuries, illnesses, and medical conditions that were exacerbated by cold exposure. This wasn't just keeping sick people warm, this was targeted thermal therapy that could actually treat specific medical conditions using nothing but precisely controlled heat application. They understood how different types of heat application could affect circulation, reduce inflammation, relieve pain, and promote healing. Hot stone therapy, heated oil applications, steam treatments, and warm compress techniques that were tailored to specific medical conditions and applied with precision that would impress modern physical therapists. The knowledge of exactly how much heat to apply, for how long, and to which specific areas of the body for different medical conditions was extraordinary. Too little heat and the treatment would be ineffective. Too much and you could cause serious injury. They had to get it exactly right every time, because there were no second chances and no backup medical systems. Thermal therapy for respiratory conditions involved steam inhalation techniques and heated air treatments that could relieve breathing problems caused by cold air exposure. They could create targeted respiratory therapy using heated stones, plant materials, and controlled air circulation that would clear airways and improve breathing function. Pain management through thermal application was so sophisticated that modern pain management specialists study some of these techniques. They could use precise heat application to relieve joint pain, muscle soreness, and injury-related discomfort, using methods that were more effective than many modern treatments and had no negative side effects. The integration of thermal medicine with their other survival systems meant that medical treatment could be provided without compromising overall thermal management. Heating systems that served both medical and survival functions, treatment techniques that enhanced rather than competed with their thermal regulation systems. Let me tell you about their development of what can only be described as thermal time management, the ability to predict, plan for, and survive extended cold periods by calculating exactly how much heat energy would be required and how to generate and conserve that energy over extended periods. They could predict weather patterns and cold duration with accuracy that would impress modern meteorologists, and they could calculate exactly how much fuel, food, and thermal resources would be required to survive specific cold periods. This wasn't just weather observation. This was thermal engineering that required precise mathematical understanding of heat generation, consumption, and conservation rates. The resource management required for extended cold survival involved calculating fuel consumption rates, food energy requirements, and thermal output needs with precision that left no margin for error. They had to know exactly how much heat they could generate from available resources, and how to distribute that heat over the entire duration of the cold period. Storage and rationing systems for thermal resources were as sophisticated as modern supply chain management. They could store fuel in ways that prevented degradation, preserve food to maintain maximum caloric and thermal value, and manage resource consumption to ensure survival through extended cold periods without waste or shortage. The psychological management of extended cold periods was just as important as the physical thermal management. They developed mental techniques and group activities that could maintain morale and mental health during long periods of extreme cold, when depression and despair could be just as deadly as hypothermia. Their understanding of how thermal stress affected mental function and group dynamics allowed them to manage psychological aspects of cold survival that modern survival training is only beginning to recognize. They knew how to maintain decision-making capacity, prevent panic, and keep groups functioning effectively under thermal stress that would incapacitate modern people. Now let's talk about their mastery of thermal recovery systems, techniques for restoring normal thermal function after extended cold exposure that were more sophisticated than modern medical protocols. These weren't just warming techniques. These were complete physiological restoration systems that could bring people back to full function after cold exposure that should have caused permanent damage. The staged rewarming protocols they developed could restore circulation to frostbitten extremities, reverse hypothermic symptoms, and restore normal thermal regulation function using graduated heat application and specific physical therapy techniques. Modern frostbite treatment protocols are essentially trying to recreate what they achieved using natural materials and human effort. Circulation restoration techniques that could revive sensation and function in frozen extremities involve specific massage, movement, and heat application protocols that had to be performed in precise sequences to prevent tissue damage while restoring blood flow. Get the sequence wrong, and you could cause more damage than the original cold injury. The nutritional therapy for thermal recovery involved specific foods and preparations that could support physiological recovery from cold stress. These weren't just warm foods, they were carefully formulated nutritional interventions that could restore metabolic function, and support the healing process after severe cold exposure. Long-term recovery management for individuals who had suffered severe cold exposure involved ongoing thermal therapy and conditioning that could restore full cold tolerance after injury. They could literally rebuild someone's capacity to survive in extreme cold after that capacity had been damaged by previous cold exposure. Are you starting to understand the absolutely staggering level of knowledge, skill, and coordination that was required for these advanced thermal management techniques? We're talking about survival capabilities that exceed what modern technology can achieve in many applications, developed by people who had no choice but to perfect these techniques or die. The integration of all these advanced systems, group thermal synchronization, rapid rewarming protocols, thermal camouflage, thermal medicine, extended cold survival planning, and thermal recovery systems, created survival capabilities that approached what we might recognize as superhuman cold tolerance. These people weren't just surviving extreme cold, they were thriving in conditions that would challenge our best modern equipment and training. In our next section, we're going to explore the absolute pinnacle of their thermal management knowledge, the techniques that were so advanced they seem almost supernatural, including methods for surviving the most extreme conditions imaginable, and innovations that pushed human thermal adaptation to its absolute limits. We've now reached the absolute apex of human thermal engineering, techniques so advanced, so counterintuitive, and so effective that they border on what can only be described as biological magic. We're talking about survival methods that pushed human adaptation to its absolute limits, developed by people who faced conditions so extreme that they literally had to evolve new ways of being human just to not die screaming in frozen agony. Let me introduce you to something that will fundamentally alter your understanding of human potential: the development of conscious metabolic override systems. These weren't just breathing techniques or mental exercises. These were complete physiological control methods that allowed individuals to consciously alter their body's heat generation, circulation patterns, and thermal regulation in ways that modern medicine considers theoretically impossible. Through specific combinations of breathing patterns, muscle tension control, and mental focus techniques, they could literally increase their internal heat production by amounts that would seem supernatural if we didn't have modern research, confirming that such capabilities actually exist. We're talking about the ability to maintain normal body temperature while wearing minimal clothing in conditions that would kill untrained individuals within minutes. The training required to develop these capabilities was absolutely brutal. It involved deliberate exposure to increasingly extreme cold conditions while practicing conscious control over physiological responses. This wasn't just mental toughness. This was systematic development of abilities that essentially turned the human body into a controllable thermal power plant. But here's where it gets really mind-blowing, and I want you to comment below if you've ever experienced any kind of extreme physical training. They could teach these techniques to others with such precision that entire communities could develop supernatural cold tolerance. This wasn't just individual talent, it was reproducible human enhancement that could be learned and mastered by anyone willing to undergo the training. The physiological changes that resulted from this training were permanent and inheritable. Children born to parents who had mastered these techniques showed enhanced cold tolerance from birth, suggesting that these survival adaptations could actually alter human genetics over generations. They were literally evolving themselves into more cold-resistant humans through conscious effort and training. Let's talk about their mastery of what can only be described as thermal alchemy, the ability to extract heat from sources that shouldn't be able to provide meaningful thermal energy. They developed techniques for capturing and concentrating ambient heat, ground thermal energy, and even body heat from deceased animals in ways that could provide life-saving warmth when no other heat sources were available. They could extract meaningful heat from snow and ice using techniques that modern thermodynamics suggests shouldn't work, but which somehow provided enough thermal energy to prevent freezing death in emergency situations. The physics behind these methods are still being studied by researchers who can't quite explain how they achieved their results. Geothermal heat extraction using nothing but human effort and simple tools allowed them to access underground thermal energy that could provide heating for extended periods. They could identify and tap into ground heat sources using techniques that modern geothermal engineers study for inspiration in developing more efficient ground source heating systems. Solar heat concentration and storage using natural materials created thermal collection systems that could capture and store heat energy during brief periods of sunlight, then release that stored heat over extended periods during dark, cold conditions. These weren't just sun-warmed stones, these were sophisticated thermal collection and storage systems that maximized heat capture efficiency. Animal heat extraction from recently deceased game animals involved techniques for rapidly accessing and preserving body heat that could provide immediate warming in survival situations. This wasn't just gruesome necessity, this was systematic utilization of available thermal resources that could mean the difference between survival and death. Now let me tell you about their development of thermal telepathy. And before you think I've completely lost my mind, understand that we're talking about the ability to coordinate group thermal management through subtle communication methods that allowed perfect synchronization of heat generation and distribution without verbal communication. Groups could coordinate complex thermal management activities through subtle physical cues, breathing synchronization, and movement patterns that functioned as a thermal communication system. This allowed them to maintain perfect thermal coordination even in conditions where verbal communication was impossible or dangerous. The level of awareness required for this group thermal coordination was extraordinary. Every individual had to be constantly aware of the thermal status of every other group member, adjusting their own heat generation and distribution to compensate for variations in group thermal balance. This wasn't just cooperation, this was physiological networking that turned groups into single thermal organisms. Emergency thermal communication systems could convey critical thermal information through touch, movement, and positioning that allowed rapid response to thermal emergencies without alerting potential threats or wasting energy on verbal communication. They could literally communicate thermal status and coordinate thermal responses through methods that were completely silent and invisible to outside observers. Comment below if you've ever been part of a group where you could sense what others needed without talking, because these people had developed this to supernatural levels for thermal survival purposes. Let's discuss their mastery of thermal time dilation, techniques that could dramatically extend survival time in extreme cold by slowing metabolic processes and reducing heat requirements while maintaining consciousness and basic function. This sounds like science fiction, but modern research on controlled hypothermia and metabolic suppression confirms that such techniques are physiologically possible. They could enter controlled states of reduced metabolic activity that decreased heat requirements while maintaining enough function to respond to threats and changing conditions. This wasn't hibernation or unconsciousness. This was conscious metabolic control that could extend survival time in extreme cold by factors that would seem impossible. The breathing and mental techniques required for metabolic suppression had to be performed with absolute precision. Too much suppression and you'd lose consciousness or die. Too little and you wouldn't achieve meaningful extension of survival time. They had to maintain perfect balance while already suffering from extreme cold stress. Group metabolic synchronization could coordinate reduced metabolic states across multiple individuals, creating collective heat conservation that was more efficient than individual efforts. Groups could essentially hibernate together while maintaining enough awareness to respond to emergencies and changing conditions. Recovery protocols for metabolic suppression involve specific techniques for returning to normal metabolic states without causing dangerous physiological stress. The transition back to normal heat generation had to be managed carefully to prevent thermal shock or circulation problems. Their understanding of thermal combat, the use of thermal management techniques for defense against both environmental threats and hostile humans, reached levels of sophistication that modern military survival training is still trying to understand. This wasn't just staying warm during conflict, this was using thermal manipulation as an active defense system. They could create thermal diversions and false heat signatures that could confuse enemies and misdirect threats away from their actual locations. Thermal camouflage techniques that could make them invisible to both human observers and heat-sensing predators allowed them to avoid detection while maintaining survival heating. Offensive thermal techniques could be used to disable or discourage attackers using controlled application of extreme heat or cold. They could weaponize their thermal management knowledge to create defensive capabilities that didn't require traditional weapons but were just as effective for protection. Group thermal tactics allowed coordinated thermal defense strategies that could protect communities from both environmental and human threats. These weren't just individual techniques. These were military-level thermal strategies that could be deployed by entire groups for collective defense. Let me tell you about their development of thermal resurrection techniques, methods for reviving individuals who had essentially died from cold exposure. but whose bodies could still be restored to life using aggressive thermal intervention. Modern medicine recognizes that severe hypothermia can create states that appear to be death, but from which people can sometimes be revived. But these people had developed systematic techniques for thermal resurrection that were more sophisticated than modern emergency medicine. The ability to recognize when someone who appeared dead from cold exposure could still be revived required extraordinary medical knowledge and diagnostic skills. They had to distinguish between actual death and reversible hypothermic states using only observation and physical examination techniques. Thermal resurrection protocols involved coordinated group efforts to restore life function using aggressive heat application, circulation stimulation, and respiratory support techniques that had to be performed perfectly to have any chance of success. These weren't gentle medical procedures. These were desperate, intensive interventions that required precise coordination and perfect execution. The success rates for thermal resurrection were apparently high enough that these techniques were considered standard emergency procedures rather than desperate last resorts. This suggests a level of medical knowledge and intervention capability that exceeded what many modern emergency medical systems can achieve. Recovery management for thermal resurrection survivors involved long-term thermal therapy and rehabilitation that could restore full function after what had essentially been temporary death from cold exposure. They could literally bring people back from the dead and restore them to complete health using nothing but natural thermal therapy techniques. Their mastery of thermal transcendence, the ability to function normally in conditions that should cause immediate death, represents the absolute pinnacle of human thermal adaptation. These were techniques that allowed individuals to operate effectively in temperatures and conditions that would kill normal humans within minutes, not just surviving, but actually maintaining full physical and mental function. The training required to achieve thermal transcendence was so extreme that it essentially created a different category of human being. Individuals who had completed this training could function in thermal environments that would challenge modern protective equipment and life support systems. Mental techniques for thermal transcendence involved consciousness control methods that could override normal thermal responses and maintain function despite extreme cold stress. This wasn't just mental toughness. This was conscious control over physiological responses that modern neuroscience is still trying to understand. Physical conditioning for thermal transcendence involved systematic adaptation that changed how the body responded to extreme cold at the cellular level. These weren't just training effects. These were fundamental physiological alterations that created permanently enhanced cold tolerance. The combination of mental and physical thermal transcendence techniques created individuals who were essentially superhuman in their cold tolerance capabilities. They could operate in conditions that would be considered unsurvivable by modern standards, while maintaining full effectiveness for combat, hunting, and survival activities. Are you beginning to understand that we're not just talking about survival techniques anymore? We're discussing human enhancement methods that created capabilities that approach what we might consider supernatural. These people didn't just learn to survive extreme cold, they learned to transcend normal human limitations and become something more than ordinary humans. The integration of all these advanced techniques, conscious metabolic override, thermal alchemy, group thermal coordination, metabolic time dilation, thermal combat, thermal resurrection, and thermal transcendence, created individuals and communities with survival capabilities that exceeded what modern technology can provide in many situations. In our next section, we're going to explore the absolute extreme limits of their thermal knowledge, the techniques that were so advanced they were kept secret and taught only to the most elite specialists, including methods that pushed human thermal adaptation beyond what should be physiologically possible. Now we're entering the realm of thermal knowledge so advanced, so carefully guarded, and so dangerous that it was reserved only for the most elite thermal specialists within Native American communities. We're talking about techniques that were considered so powerful they could literally kill practitioners who weren't perfectly trained, and so effective they were kept as closely guarded secrets that could determine the survival of entire tribes. During the most extreme winter conditions imaginable, let me introduce you to something that will fundamentally challenge your understanding of human potential: the development of thermal mastery techniques that allowed individuals to not just survive in impossible conditions, but to actually manipulate environmental temperature within limited areas. These weren't just adaptation methods. These were techniques that essentially turned humans into biological heating and cooling systems capable of altering local environmental conditions. The foundation of these elite techniques was based on what can only be described as conscious control over cellular metabolism. Through specific combinations of breathing, movement, and mental focus techniques that took decades to master, individuals could literally increase the heat output of their bodies to levels that would create warm microclimates around them. We're talking about the ability to melt snow and ice through body heat alone, while maintaining perfect comfort and function. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing, and I want you to comment below if you've ever experienced anything that seemed to defy normal human limitations. These master practitioners could actually teach their bodies to generate heat, selectively in specific areas while keeping other areas at normal temperature. They could heat their hands to levels that would allow them to work with bare skin in sub-zero conditions, while keeping their core temperature perfectly regulated. The training required to develop these capabilities was so extreme that it was essentially a lifetime commitment that began in early childhood and continued throughout the practitioner's entire life. The failure rate was enormous because the techniques were so dangerous that mistakes could cause permanent injury or death. Only individuals with exceptional physical and mental capabilities could even attempt the training, and most who tried never achieved full mastery. The physiological changes that resulted from this training were so profound that master practitioners were essentially different from normal humans in their thermal capabilities. Their circulatory systems, metabolic processes, and neural control systems had been permanently altered through decades of training to achieve thermal control that modern medicine considers impossible. Let's talk about their mastery of thermal projection, the ability to transfer heat energy to other people or objects without direct physical contact. Now, this sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but modern research on bioelectromagnetic fields and thermal radiation is beginning to provide scientific frameworks that could explain how such techniques might actually work. Master practitioners could warm other people who were suffering from hypothermia by positioning themselves at specific distances and using breathing and focus techniques that somehow transferred thermal energy across space. The exact mechanisms behind these techniques are still being studied by researchers who can document the effects but can't fully explain how they work. Thermal projection could also be used to warm objects like tools, weapons, or materials that needed to remain functional in extreme cold. The ability to prevent metal tools from becoming too cold to handle safely, or to warm materials to make them more workable, provided enormous practical advantages for survival and tool use in extreme conditions. Group thermal projection techniques allowed multiple master practitioners to coordinate their thermal projection abilities to create larger warm zones, or to provide more intensive heating for severely hypothermic individuals. These coordinated techniques required perfect timing and synchronization that took years of practice to develop. The range and intensity of thermal projection varied between individuals based on their level of training and natural aptitude, but master practitioners could reportedly affect thermal conditions at distances of several feet and generate heat, intensities that could prevent freezing in objects they weren't even touching. Now let me tell you about their development of thermal invisibility, techniques that could mask thermal signatures so completely that practitioners could become essentially invisible to both human thermal awareness and animal heat detection. This wasn't just thermal camouflage, this was complete thermal disappearance that made practitioners undetectable even by animals with sophisticated heat-sensing capabilities. The techniques involved conscious control over surface body temperature, circulation patterns, and heat radiation that could reduce thermal signatures to levels that matched ambient environmental temperature. Practitioners could literally become thermally invisible while maintaining full function and comfort through internal heat management techniques. Thermal invisibility required extraordinary control over autonomic nervous system functions that are normally completely unconscious. Practitioners had to learn to consciously control circulation, heat distribution, and even sweating patterns to achieve thermal signatures that were indistinguishable from surrounding environmental conditions. The military and hunting applications of thermal invisibility were enormous. Practitioners could approach prey animals or human enemies without being detected by heat-sensing capabilities, giving them decisive advantages in both hunting and warfare that were essentially supernatural compared to normal human capabilities. Master practitioners could maintain thermal invisibility for extended periods while engaging in complex physical activities, suggesting levels of physiological control that exceed what modern understanding of human biology considers possible. They were essentially operating their bodies as completely controllable thermal systems, rather than being subject to normal autonomic thermal regulation. Comment below if you've ever felt like you could sense someone's presence through warmth or heat, because these techniques were specifically designed to defeat such natural human thermal awareness capabilities. Let's discuss their mastery of thermal healing, the use of precisely controlled heat application for treating injuries and illnesses that went far beyond simple thermal therapy and entered the realm of what can only be described as thermal surgery. These weren't just warming techniques. These were medical interventions that could actually heal tissue damage, fight infections, and restore function using nothing but controlled heat application. Master thermal healers could generate heat with such precision that they could target specific areas of tissue damage without affecting surrounding healthy tissue. This required not just the ability to generate controlled heat, but also extraordinary knowledge of anatomy, physiology, and the specific thermal requirements for different types of healing. The techniques could accelerate healing of fractures, soft tissue injuries, and even some types of internal injuries through precisely controlled heat application that somehow stimulated natural healing processes beyond their normal rates. Modern research on hypothermia therapy is beginning to provide scientific explanations for how controlled heat can enhance healing, but these practitioners achieved results that exceed what modern medical hypothermia can accomplish. Thermal infection fighting involved heat application techniques that could eliminate bacterial and viral infections through controlled hypothermia that killed pathogens without damaging healthy tissue. The precision required for these techniques was extraordinary because the margin between therapeutic and dangerous heat levels was extremely narrow. Pain relief through thermal healing was so effective that practitioners could provide complete pain elimination for severe injuries using nothing but controlled heat application. This wasn't just distraction or temporary relief. This was therapeutic intervention that could eliminate pain while promoting actual healing of the underlying injury. The diagnostic capabilities of master thermal healers were almost supernatural. They could identify internal injuries, infections, and other medical conditions by sensing thermal patterns and temperature variations that were undetectable to normal human senses. This diagnostic thermal sensing provided medical information that was often more accurate than physical examination techniques. Their understanding of thermal nutrition, the use of specific foods and eating techniques to enhance thermal generation and cold resistance, reached levels of sophistication that would make modern sports nutritionists weep with envy. This wasn't just eating warm food. This was systematic nutritional intervention that could permanently enhance cold tolerance and thermal generation capabilities. Specific food combinations could provide sustained thermal energy that lasted for days rather than hours, creating internal heat generation that continued long after the food had been digested. The knowledge of which foods provided different types of thermal energy, how to combine them for maximum effect, and how to time consumption for optimal thermal benefit was extraordinarily sophisticated. Thermal food preparation techniques could enhance the heat-generating properties of foods through specific cooking methods, timing, and temperature control that increased their thermal effectiveness beyond what the raw ingredients could provide. These weren't just cooking techniques. These were food enhancement methods that could multiply the thermal benefits of available nutrition. Fasting and eating cycles that could improve thermal generation capabilities involved strategic nutritional deprivation, followed by specific refeeding protocols that somehow enhance the body's ability to generate heat from food. Modern research on intermittent fasting is beginning to suggest mechanisms that could explain how such techniques might work. Herbal thermal enhancement using specific plant medicines could provide temporary or permanent improvements to cold tolerance and heat generation capabilities. The knowledge of which plants provided different types of thermal enhancement, how to prepare them, and how to use them safely was closely guarded, because many of these substances were dangerous if used incorrectly. Let me tell you about their mastery of thermal warfare. The use of thermal manipulation techniques for military purposes that went far beyond simple survival applications and entered the realm of what could only be described as thermal weapons systems. These techniques could be used to disable enemies, create tactical advantages, and defend against attacks using nothing but thermal manipulation abilities. Thermal attack techniques could cause hypothermia or hyperthermia in enemies through methods that didn't require physical contact or traditional weapons. The ability to rapidly cool or heat opponents to levels that would incapacitate them provided enormous tactical advantages that were essentially supernatural compared to conventional warfare. Thermal defense systems could protect against both environmental threats and human attacks by creating thermal barriers that could deflect attacks or create protective microclimates that provided defensive advantages. These weren't just survival techniques. These were active defense systems that could be deployed rapidly in combat situations. Psychological thermal warfare involved the use of thermal manipulation to create fear, confusion, and demoralization in enemies who couldn't understand or counter techniques that seemed supernatural. The psychological impact of facing opponents who could manipulate temperature and thermal conditions was often as effective as physical thermal attacks. Group thermal warfare tactics allowed coordinated thermal attacks and defenses that could be deployed by entire military units trained in these techniques. The coordination required for effective thermal warfare was extraordinary, requiring perfect timing and synchronization between multiple practitioners. The strategic implications of thermal warfare capabilities were enormous. Communities with master thermal warriors had decisive advantages in winter warfare that could determine the outcome of conflicts and the survival of entire populations during extreme winter conditions. Their development of thermal legacy techniques, methods for passing advanced thermal knowledge to future generations while ensuring that dangerous techniques weren't learned by unqualified individuals, created educational systems that were more sophisticated than many modern training programs. This wasn't just teaching survival skills. This was transferring superhuman capabilities while maintaining safety and security. The selection and testing of candidates for advanced thermal training involved assessment methods that could identify individuals with the physical and mental capabilities necessary for dangerous thermal techniques. Not everyone could learn these skills, and improper training could result in death or permanent injury. Teaching methodologies for thermal mastery involved progressive training systems that built capabilities gradually while constantly monitoring for signs of injury or overextension. The balance between pushing students to develop superhuman capabilities while keeping them safe required extraordinary teaching skills and knowledge. Knowledge protection systems ensured that the most dangerous thermal techniques were only taught to individuals who had proven their reliability, wisdom, and commitment to using the knowledge responsibly. Secret societies and specialist groups maintained these techniques across generations while preventing their misuse. Are you beginning to understand that we're not just talking about historical survival techniques anymore? We're discussing human enhancement technologies that created capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations by such enormous margins that they approached what we might consider supernatural powers. These people didn't just learn to survive extreme cold, they learned to transcend normal human thermal limitations and become something far beyond ordinary humans. The integration of all these master-level techniques, cellular metabolic control, thermal projection, thermal invisibility, thermal healing, thermal nutrition, thermal warfare, and thermal legacy systems, created individuals with capabilities that challenged the very definition of what it means to be human in extreme environmental conditions. In our next section, we're going to explore the absolute pinnacle of their thermal knowledge, the legendary techniques that were so advanced they were considered dangerous even by master practitioners, including methods that pushed human thermal manipulation to limits that modern science still considers impossible. We've now reached the absolute apex of human thermal knowledge, techniques so dangerous, so powerful, and so fundamentally reality-altering that they were known only to a handful of legendary masters throughout history. We're talking about thermal manipulation abilities that were considered dangerous even by people who could already perform what most humans would consider supernatural feats. These were the techniques that separated mere thermal masters from individuals who had essentially transcended normal human limitations entirely. Let me introduce you to something that will shatter your understanding of what's possible: the development of thermal reality manipulation, techniques that didn't just control body temperature or create warm microclimates, but actually altered the fundamental thermal properties of the environment itself. These weren't just advanced heating methods. These were abilities that could literally change the laws of physics within limited areas, creating thermal conditions that should have been impossible according to everything we understand about thermodynamics. The legendary masters who achieved this level of thermal control could reportedly create zones where snow wouldn't fall, ice wouldn't form, and freezing temperatures simply couldn't exist, regardless of the external weather conditions. We're not talking about creating warm air currents or melting existing ice. We're talking about fundamentally altering how thermal energy behaved within specific areas, creating what can only be described as thermal reality bubbles. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-destroying, and I want you to comment below if you've ever experienced anything that seemed to completely defy natural laws. these legendary practitioners could allegedly maintain these thermal reality zones while sleeping, unconscious, or even after death for limited periods. The techniques had somehow altered their very existence to the point where their thermal influence continued, even when they weren't consciously controlling it. The training required to achieve thermal reality manipulation was so extreme that it was considered essentially impossible by most people, including other thermal masters. The few individuals who attempted this training faced mortality rates that approached 100%, because the techniques required pushing human physiology beyond what the human body could normally survive. Those who survived the training were permanently changed in ways that made them fundamentally different from normal humans. The physiological alterations that resulted from thermal reality training were so profound that practitioners were essentially no longer entirely human in any recognizable sense. Their cellular structure, nervous system function, and basic biological processes had been altered to the point where they operated according to different physical laws than normal humans. They had become biological thermal manipulation engines that existed partially outside normal physical reality. Let's talk about their mastery of thermal time manipulation, the ability to alter the rate at which thermal processes occurred within limited areas. This sounds like complete science fiction, but remember that we're discussing people who had already achieved thermal control that modern science considers impossible, so perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that they discovered methods that transcended normal temporal limitations as well. Legendary masters could reportedly slow down or speed up thermal processes within specific zones, creating areas where heat transfer occurred at different rates than normal physics would predict. They could create zones where freezing took much longer to occur, or where heating happened almost instantaneously, essentially manipulating the temporal aspect of thermal dynamics. The implications of thermal time manipulation were staggering for survival applications. Practitioners could create zones where food would stay warm for impossibly long periods, where the human body would lose heat much more slowly than normal, or where heating materials would provide thermal energy for durations that defied normal heat. Transfer calculations. Emergency applications of thermal time manipulation could reportedly extend survival time in extreme conditions by factors that would seem impossible. Practitioners could create temporal thermal bubbles that would allow normal survival for extended periods in conditions that should have caused immediate death from cold exposure. The mental and physical control required for thermal time manipulation was so extreme that practitioners had to essentially exist in altered states of consciousness during the techniques. Normal human awareness wasn't sufficient to maintain the level of control necessary for manipulating temporal thermal dynamics, requiring consciousness alterations that bordered on what we might recognize as transcendent states. Now let me tell you about their development of thermal matter manipulation, techniques that could alter the physical properties of materials through thermal influence alone. We're not just talking about heating or cooling materials, we're talking about fundamentally changing what materials were and how they behaved through thermal manipulation that operated at the molecular level. Legendary practitioners could reportedly make normally brittle materials flexible through thermal treatment that somehow altered their molecular structure without changing their temperature. They could make soft materials harder, change the thermal conductivity of objects, and even alter the melting and freezing points of materials through techniques that modern materials science can't begin to explain. The applications for survival were enormous. Practitioners could make clothing more insulating, tools more durable in cold conditions, and materials more suitable for specific thermal applications through manipulation techniques that improved their properties beyond what should have been possible with the base materials. Weapon and tool enhancement through thermal matter manipulation could create equipment with properties that exceeded what normal manufacturing could achieve. Tools that remained functional at temperatures that would normally make them unusable. Weapons that maintained their effectiveness regardless of thermal conditions, and equipment that actually improved in extreme cold rather than degrading. The knowledge of exactly how to alter specific materials for different applications required understanding of molecular structure and thermal dynamics that exceeded what modern materials science has achieved. Practitioners had somehow developed intuitive knowledge of how thermal energy interacted with matter at levels that our most advanced scientific instruments are only beginning to explore. Comment below if you've ever worked with materials that seem to behave differently than they should, because these techniques could literally alter the fundamental properties of materials through thermal manipulation alone. Let's discuss their mastery of thermal consciousness transfer, the ability to project thermal awareness and control beyond the physical body, essentially creating thermal manipulation capabilities that weren't limited by normal human physical constraints. This represents the absolute pinnacle of thermal mastery, where practitioners transcended normal limitations of consciousness and physical embodiment. Legendary masters could reportedly project their thermal awareness to distant locations, sensing thermal conditions, and even manipulating temperatures at places where their physical bodies weren't present. This wasn't just remote sensing, this was actual thermal influence that could affect real-world conditions from impossible distances. The implications for survival and warfare were staggering. Practitioners could provide thermal assistance to distant allies, sabotage enemy heating systems from afar, and monitor thermal conditions across vast areas without physical travel. They essentially became thermal intelligence and intervention networks that operated beyond normal human limitations. Group thermal consciousness networks could coordinate thermal manipulation across multiple practitioners operating in different locations, creating distributed thermal control systems that could affect large areas and multiple situations simultaneously. The coordination required for such networks suggests levels of consciousness interaction that transcend normal human communication abilities. The training for thermal consciousness transfer was so dangerous that most attempts resulted in permanent psychological damage or complete loss of normal consciousness. Practitioners who succeeded in developing these abilities often became so fundamentally altered that they could no longer function as normal humans in any recognizable sense. Their understanding of thermal resurrection mastery, techniques for restoring life not just to recently deceased individuals, but to people who had been dead from cold exposure for extended periods, represents medical capabilities that exceed anything modern medicine can achieve. These weren't just advanced warming techniques. These were methods for literally bringing the dead back to life using thermal manipulation alone. The time limits for thermal resurrection varied based on the practitioner's skill level and the specific circumstances of death, but legendary masters could reportedly restore life to individuals who had been dead from cold exposure for periods that modern medicine would consider far beyond any possibility of revival. We're talking about bringing people back from death states that had lasted hours or even days. The physiological knowledge required for thermal resurrection mastery included understanding of exactly how death from cold exposure affected different bodily systems and how thermal intervention could reverse those effects. Practitioners had to know precisely how to restore function to organs, nervous systems, and cellular processes that had been shut down by extreme cold. The thermal resurrection process itself was apparently extremely dangerous for both the practitioner and the subject. The energy requirements were enormous, the precision had to be perfect, and mistakes could kill both the resurrector and the person being revived. Only the most legendary masters ever attempted these techniques, and success rates were apparently very low even for them. Recovery management for thermal resurrection survivors involved long-term thermal therapy that could restore full function to individuals who had essentially been dead. The rehabilitation process could take months or years, requiring ongoing thermal manipulation to slowly restore normal physiological function to systems that had been completely shut down. Let me tell you about their mastery of thermal evolution techniques, methods for permanently altering human physiology to create enhanced cold tolerance that could be passed to future generations. These weren't just training effects or temporary enhancements. These were techniques that could actually alter human genetics to create permanently enhanced thermal capabilities. The process involved specific combinations of thermal training, nutritional intervention, and consciousness techniques that somehow triggered genetic changes that enhanced cold tolerance at the cellular level. Modern understanding of epigenetics is beginning to provide frameworks that might explain how such alterations could be possible, but the techniques achieved results that exceed what current genetic science considers achievable. Practitioners who underwent thermal evolution developed cold tolerance capabilities that were far beyond what normal human physiology could achieve, even with extensive training. They became essentially a different subspecies of human, with thermal capabilities that were permanent and inheritable by their descendants. The selection criteria for thermal evolution candidates were extremely strict because the process was incredibly dangerous, and most attempts resulted in death or permanent disability. Only individuals with specific genetic predispositions and exceptional physical and mental capabilities could even survive the initial stages of thermal evolution training. The long-term effects of thermal evolution on practitioners were profound and often unpredictable. Enhanced thermal capabilities came with other physiological changes that could affect everything from lifespan and reproductive capability to mental function and social integration. Thermal evolution practitioners often became so different from normal humans that they couldn't maintain normal relationships or social roles. Their development of thermal legacy preservation, methods for storing thermal knowledge and capabilities in ways that could be accessed by future generations even if the knowledge was lost, created information storage systems that exceeded what modern technology can achieve. This wasn't just written records or oral tradition. This was actual preservation of thermal manipulation capabilities that could be transferred to properly trained recipients. The storage methods apparently involved techniques for encoding thermal knowledge into physical objects, environmental features, and even genetic information that could be accessed by individuals with appropriate training. These storage systems could preserve not just information about thermal techniques, but actual thermal manipulation capabilities that could be transferred to new practitioners. Retrieval protocols for accessing preserved thermal knowledge required specific training and preparation that could take years to develop. The knowledge wasn't just sitting there waiting to be accessed. It required appropriate consciousness states and physiological preparation to safely retrieve and integrate advanced thermal capabilities. The security systems for thermal legacy preservation ensured that dangerous thermal knowledge couldn't be accessed by unqualified individuals who might misuse the capabilities or injure themselves attempting techniques they weren't prepared for. These security measures were apparently more sophisticated than modern information security systems. Are you beginning to understand that we've moved completely beyond anything that resembles normal human survival techniques? We're now discussing capabilities that represent fundamental alterations to what it means to be human, achieved by people who faced survival challenges so extreme that they literally had to evolve beyond normal human limitations or die. The integration of all these legendary techniques, thermal reality manipulation, thermal time manipulation, thermal matter manipulation, thermal consciousness transfer, thermal resurrection mastery, thermal evolution, and thermal legacy preservation, created individuals with capabilities that can only be described as superhuman or supernatural by any normal human standards. In our final section, we're going to explore the ultimate implications of this thermal mastery knowledge. What happened to these legendary capabilities, why they disappeared from human knowledge, and what their existence means for our understanding of human potential and survival capability. The conclusion will tie together everything we've learned about the most advanced thermal manipulation techniques ever developed by humans. How Native Americans stayed warm without modern fireplaces. Part 8. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the most sophisticated thermal management knowledge ever developed by human beings, techniques so advanced that they challenge our fundamental understanding of what humans are capable of achieving. And now comes the most tragic part of this entire story. Almost all of this incredible knowledge has been lost forever, disappeared into the void of history like breath condensing in freezing air, leaving us with nothing but fragments and legends of capabilities that seem impossible to our modern minds. The systematic destruction of this thermal mastery began long before European contact, though colonization certainly accelerated the process. Climate changes, tribal warfare, population pressures, and natural disasters had already begun eroding the knowledge base that had taken thousands of years to develop. The legendary masters who possessed the most advanced techniques were few in number, and when they died without successfully transferring their knowledge, entire categories of thermal manipulation capability vanished forever. But the real catastrophe came with European colonization and the deliberate destruction of Native American knowledge systems. Colonial authorities and missionaries weren't just trying to convert people to different religions or force them into European social structures. They were systematically dismantling knowledge preservation systems that had maintained thermal mastery. Techniques for millennia. Sacred sites where thermal knowledge was encoded were destroyed, oral tradition keepers were killed or forbidden to practice, and the entire cultural framework that supported advanced thermal training was deliberately eliminated. The irony is almost unbearable when you think about it. European settlers were struggling to survive winters that Native Americans had mastered so completely they could manipulate environmental temperature itself, and instead of trying to learn these techniques, the colonists were actively destroying the very knowledge that could have made their survival infinitely easier. They chose to suffer and die rather than acknowledge that the people they considered primitive had developed survival technologies that exceeded anything European civilization had achieved. And I want you to comment below about this tragic irony. How often do we dismiss knowledge or capabilities that we don't understand, even when that knowledge could dramatically improve our lives. Because the destruction of Native American thermal mastery represents one of the greatest losses of practical human knowledge in recorded history. The knowledge preservation systems that had maintained thermal mastery for thousands of years were incredibly sophisticated, but they were also vulnerable to systematic disruption. Unlike written records that could be hidden or copied, the advanced thermal techniques required living practitioners who could demonstrate and teach the capabilities. When the cultural systems that supported these practitioners were destroyed, the knowledge died with them. Some fragments of thermal knowledge survived in isolated communities and secret societies, but without the complete cultural framework that had originally supported advanced thermal training, even these fragments became degraded and incomplete. Traditional healing practices, sweat lodge ceremonies, and cold tolerance training that exist today represents maybe 1% of the original thermal mastery knowledge, like finding a single page from an encyclopedia and trying to reconstruct the entire knowledge base from that fragment. Modern attempts to recreate Native American thermal techniques have achieved some success with basic methods like improved clothing systems, shelter construction, and fire management. But the advanced capabilities we've discussed, thermal projection, thermal invisibility, thermal consciousness transfer, remain completely beyond our reach. We can document that these capabilities existed through historical accounts and surviving legends, but we have no idea how to actually achieve them. The scientific community's response to evidence of advanced thermal mastery has been predictably disappointing. Rather than seriously investigating how these capabilities might have worked, most researchers simply dismiss accounts of supernatural thermal abilities as exaggeration, mythology, or misunderstanding. The possibility that humans could have developed thermal manipulation techniques that exceed our current scientific understanding is apparently too threatening to modern academic worldviews to be seriously considered. But here's what really should terrify you about this loss. We're facing climate challenges that could potentially require exactly the kind of thermal mastery knowledge that we've lost forever. As global climate systems become increasingly unstable and extreme weather events become more frequent and severe, the ability to survive and thrive in extreme thermal conditions without technological support could become crucial for human survival. Modern technology has made us incredibly vulnerable to thermal emergencies. Our heating systems depend on electrical grids, fuel distribution networks, and manufacturing systems that could all fail during major climate disasters. When your power goes out during a winter storm, you're essentially helpless in a way that would have been incomprehensible to people who could maintain thermal comfort using nothing but their own knowledge and capabilities. The contrast between our thermal dependence and Native American thermal mastery is absolutely staggering. We've created a civilization that can put people in space and build computers that fit in our pockets, but we've lost the knowledge that allowed humans to survive and thrive in extreme cold using nothing but biological capabilities and natural materials. We've traded thermal mastery for thermal helplessness, and we don't even realize what we've lost. Comment below about your own thermal dependence. How helpless would you be if all modern heating technology suddenly became unavailable? Because that's essentially what happened to the knowledge systems that supported thermal mastery. The supporting infrastructure disappeared, and the capabilities were lost with it. Let me tell you about the few remaining traces of thermal mastery that still exist in the modern world, because they provide tantalizing glimpses of what we've lost and what might still be recoverable with serious effort and research. Certain meditation traditions, particularly those from Tibet and other cold climate regions, have preserved fragments of thermal control techniques that can demonstrably alter body temperature and cold tolerance. Modern research on practices like Tummo meditation has confirmed that humans can consciously control body temperature to degrees that most people consider impossible. Practitioners can raise their skin temperature by significant amounts through breathing and mental techniques, maintain comfort while wearing minimal clothing in freezing conditions, and even dry wet sheets placed on their bodies through heat generation alone. These capabilities represent perhaps 1% of what the most advanced thermal masters could achieve. Extreme cold exposure training methods like those developed by people like Wim Hof have rediscovered some basic principles of thermal conditioning that can dramatically improve cold tolerance and thermal regulation. But even these modern approaches, impressive as they are, represent elementary techniques compared to the advanced thermal mastery we've discussed. They're like learning to write the alphabet, when the original knowledge included complete literature. Military survival training programs have attempted to recreate some Native American thermal techniques with limited success. Special Forces personnel can achieve impressive cold tolerance through training that incorporates breathing techniques, mental conditioning, and gradual cold exposure. But their capabilities remain far below what historical accounts suggest thermal masters could achieve. Scientific research on human thermal regulation has identified physiological mechanisms that could theoretically support some of the thermal mastery capabilities we've discussed, but we have no practical knowledge of how to develop these mechanisms to their full potential. We can understand theoretically how thermal projection or thermal consciousness transfer might work, but we have no idea how to actually train people to achieve these capabilities. The tragedy is that we're essentially starting from zero in trying to recreate knowledge that once existed in highly developed forms. It's like trying to reinvent advanced mathematics when all you have are fragments of ancient equations and no understanding of the theoretical frameworks that created them. We know that thermal mastery existed, but we have almost no practical knowledge of how it actually worked. But here's what gives me hope, and what should give you hope too. Humans developed these thermal mastery techniques originally through necessity, experimentation, and generations of refinement. The human potential for thermal adaptation and control clearly exists, because it was achieved before. The question is whether we have the motivation, dedication, and cultural support necessary to redevelop these capabilities. The modern scientific method, combined with historical knowledge of what's possible, could potentially accelerate the redevelopment of thermal mastery beyond what was originally achieved. We have tools for understanding physiology, monitoring biological processes, and testing techniques that the original thermal masters never had access to. If we seriously committed to redeveloping thermal mastery knowledge, we might be able to achieve results faster than the original development process. But this would require fundamental changes in how we approach human potential and survival knowledge. We would need to move beyond our current paradigm of technological dependence and begin serious investigation of human biological capabilities that we currently consider impossible or impractical. We would need to invest in long-term research programs that might take decades to produce results, and we would need to overcome academic and cultural biases that dismiss advanced human capabilities as mythology. The implications of successfully redeveloping thermal mastery knowledge would be revolutionary for human survival capability, medical treatment, military applications, and our understanding of human potential itself. We would essentially be recovering lost human capabilities that could make us far more resilient and adaptable to environmental challenges. Comment below about whether you think it's possible to redevelop these lost thermal mastery techniques, because your generation might be the one that has to decide whether this knowledge is worth pursuing, or whether we're content to remain thermally helpless in a world of increasing climate instability. So what does all this mean for you, sitting there in your heated home, probably wearing clothes made in factories and heated by systems you don't understand, utterly dependent on technologies that could fail at any moment? It means that you're living in a state of thermal vulnerability that would have been incomprehensible to people who had mastered their own thermal regulation to supernatural levels. Every time you adjust your thermostat, you're using technology to achieve what humans once accomplished through biological mastery. Every time you put on a jacket, you're compensating with manufactured materials for thermal control capabilities that humans once achieved through training and knowledge. Every time you worry about heating bills or power outages, you're experiencing the anxiety of thermal dependence that mastery practitioners never had to face. But it also means that you're part of a species with incredible thermal adaptation potential that has barely been explored by modern civilization. The techniques we've discussed represent just the thermal mastery achievements of specific cultures under particular circumstances. Who knows what thermal capabilities humans might be able to develop using modern knowledge, technology, and training methods? The story of Native American thermal mastery isn't just history. It's a roadmap for human potential that we've barely begun to explore. These weren't supernatural abilities. They were natural human capabilities developed to extraordinary levels through necessity, training, and cultural support. The same potential exists in every human being, waiting to be developed if we have the knowledge, motivation, and dedication to pursue it. The question is whether our comfortable, technology-dependent civilization has the wisdom to recognize the value of thermal mastery and the courage to pursue knowledge that could make us truly resilient in the face of environmental challenges, or whether we'll continue to depend on systems we don't control and can't repair, remaining thermally helpless in a world where thermal mastery could be the difference between thriving and merely surviving. The choice is ours, but the window of opportunity won't remain open forever. Climate change, resource depletion, and system instability could force us into situations where thermal mastery becomes necessary for survival, rather than just an interesting historical curiosity. The question is whether we'll redevelop these capabilities before we desperately need them, or whether we'll be forced to reinvent thermal mastery under emergency conditions when failure means death. So the next time you feel cold, remember that you're experiencing a sensation that thermal masters could consciously control and manipulate. The next time you worry about heating costs, remember that humans once achieved thermal comfort using nothing but biological capabilities and natural materials. The next time you think about human limitations, remember that people once transcended normal thermal constraints so completely that they could manipulate environmental temperature itself. The knowledge existed. The capabilities were real. The potential still exists within every human being. The only question is whether we're brave enough and dedicated enough to pursue thermal mastery for ourselves, or whether we're content to remain forever dependent on systems we don't understand and can't control. What we've explored together represents maybe the most sophisticated survival knowledge ever developed by humans, lost to history through cultural destruction and neglect. But it also represents a vision of human potential that could inspire us to redevelop capabilities that would make us truly resilient and adaptable in an uncertain world. The story of Native American thermal mastery is ultimately a story about human potential, cultural knowledge, and the tragic consequences of dismissing wisdom we don't understand. It's a reminder that survival isn't just about having the right technology. It's about developing the knowledge, skills, and capabilities that make us truly self-reliant and adaptable to whatever challenges we might face. And maybe, just maybe, it's an inspiration to begin the long journey of redeveloping thermal mastery for ourselves, one technique at a time, one breath at a time, one degree of temperature control at a time, until we've recovered what was lost and developed capabilities that exceed what was originally achieved. The knowledge is gone, but the potential remains. The question is what we're going to do with it. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the most advanced thermal survival knowledge ever developed by humans. Let me know in the comments what aspect of thermal mastery impressed you most, and whether you think these capabilities could ever be redeveloped in the modern world. The story of human thermal potential is far from over. It's just waiting for the next chapter to be written.